In 1967, in the worrying days before the Six-Day War, there was a mass meeting in the Royal Albert Hall in London. The newly installed Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz, previously the Chief Rabbi of Ireland, addressed the Israeli ambassador with these words: "Brave ambassador of a brave country." Pastor John, at a time when Kristallnacht commemorations are being cancelled around the world because of the fear of disruption, I salute your brave initiative in hosting this event. Thank you. I know it is tempting to make parallels between Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the Reichspogrom, November the 9th, 1938, exactly 85 years ago, and the events of the 7th of October. But I will resist this temptation. The events of Kristallnacht are horrific in their own right, and I leave every one of you to draw your own parallels. The rivers of blood of the hundreds of Jews murdered on Kristallnacht washed away any last vestige of naivety among Jews in Germany and around the world. Those who had been predicting for years that the Hitler nightmare would not last and could not last now realized how blind they had been. The very public murder of hundreds of Jews, the very public destruction of hundreds of synagogues, the very public destruction of thousands of Jewish businesses and Jewish communal buildings, and the very public arrest of 30,000 Jewish men who were marched off to concentration camps, showed the world that Hitler's threats were no longer hypothetical. He'd promised to get rid of the Jews when he wrote Mein Kampf, and not enough people took his words seriously. The term final solution may not yet have been official Nazi policy, but there could be no longer any doubt about the fate of the Jews in Germany. And historians agree that the final solution began on Kristallnacht. For me and my family, Kristallnacht is in our DNA. The Kristallnacht saga actually began 7 months earlier, in April 1938, when the Polish parliament annulled the citizenship of Polish Jews who had lived abroad for more than 5 years. My father's parents, David Meyer and Tehila Fachler, were Polish Jews who had lived in Germany for 20 years. They fell into this category. My father, Eli, despite holding a Polish passport, was born and raised in Berlin, and his two languages were Yiddish and German and no Polish. The Polish decision sowed panic in Nazi Germany. And not wanting to be stuck with thousands of stateless Polish Jews, the Nazis took preemptive action. In the early hours of October the 28th, 1938, the day before the Polish revocation deadline. And in what became known as the Polian Aktion, 17,000 Jews were arrested, including my grandfather. My father was not arrested that night when the police came to the family's rented apartment on Brunnenstrasse 33 because he had turned 15 just 24 hours earlier, on the 27th of October, and the IBM machines used by the Nazis to keep tabs on the Jews had not yet realized this. Had the Polian Aktion happened a couple of days later, my father would have been arrested together with his father. My grandmother managed to get food and clothing to her husband the next morning before he and thousands of Polish Jews were transported by the SS and police in sealed trains to the German-Polish border. Entire families, single men and women, children and youth without adult guardians were all deported. The Germans dumped the Jews unceremoniously on the Polish border, where the German escorts fired shots into the air to frighten the Jews to hasten their crossing over the border. And at the border town of Zbonjin, Polish border guards refused to allow the Jews to enter. And in this diplomatic standoff between two anti-Semitic regimes, Germany and Poland, 9,000 Polish Jews, my grandfather included, were left in no man's land limbo in Zbonjin. The Jews were forced to establish a refugee camp in an abandoned flour mill and adjacent stables. And after a few days, my grandfather sent a letter home. In guarded language, he wrote that he was allowed to receive food parcels. He wasn't the only one to send a letter. Together with him in Zbonjin were Sendel and Rivka Greenspan and their daughter, Berta. And Berta sent a postcard to her brother Herschel, an illegal student in Paris, telling him what had happened and pleading for help. Her postcard reached Paris on Thursday, the 3rd of November. 4 days later, Herschel bought a revolver and went to the German embassy at 78 Rue de Lille, the same German embassy that Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of supplying with French military secrets 44 years earlier. And at the embassy, Herschel shot Third Secretary Ernst von Rath 5 times in the abdomen. Herschel made no attempt to resist arrest by French police. He confessed to the shooting, claiming that his motive was to avenge the persecuted German Jews. In his pocket was a postcard to his parents. It said, "With God's help, my dear parents, I could not do otherwise. May God forgive me. The heart bleeds when I hear of your tragedy. I must protest so that the whole world hears my protest. Forgive me, Hermann." Von Rath died from his injuries on the 9th of November, the 15th anniversary of the 1923 beer hall putsch, traditionally a night devoted to heavy drinking by the Nazi faithful. Von Rath's death was the convenient trigger for Kristallnacht. Propaganda Minister Goebbels declared that he expected the German people to express their outrage at the assassination by taking the law into their own hands and attacking Jewish businesses, community centers, and synagogues. And within hours of Goebbels' speech, the deadly pogrom we call Kristallnacht erupted across Germany and Austria. Here is how my father describes what happened at the Bet Zion synagogue adjoining his apartment. During the late evening of November the 9th, we heard a commotion on the streets as well as behind our home. Truckloads of SA brown shirts were smashing up our synagogue. And the reason they did not torch the synagogue was that there were non-Jews living too close by, and God forbid their property should not be damaged. The next morning, November the 10th, Goebbels made a radio announcement that a spontaneous uprising of the German people had taken place against organized Jewry, who had declared war against Germany with the assassination of Fomrat in Paris. My father continues, I can still hear Goebbels' voice ringing in my ears as he demanded that the Jews should pay for the damage of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht generated outrage across the world. Every foreign legation in Berlin, including the legations of fascist countries, reported to their respective foreign ministries expressing their shock at the brutality of Kristallnacht. All the legations except one. Ireland's Charles Bewley was the sole diplomat to say openly that he approved of Kristallnacht. The British finally woke up from their sleepwalking stupor, and Parliament urgently discussed the events of Kristallnacht. On November the 15th, 6 days after the pogrom, leaders of Britain's Jewish community met Prime Minister Chamberlain, who by now realized that his appeasement policies lay in tatters. Chamberlain was no friend of the Jews. No doubt the Jews aren't a lovable people. I don't care about them myself, he once said. But he urgently agreed to admit children up to age 17 on the basis of education and training and ultimate re-emigration to Palestine. And on the 21st of November 1938, Home Secretary Samuel Hoare announced, "Here is a chance of taking the young generation of a great people. Here is a chance of mitigating to some extent the terrible sufferings of their parents and their friends." And less than 4 weeks after Kristallnacht, the first children's transport, Kindertransport, train, left Germany with some 200 children from a Jewish orphanage in Berlin destroyed during Kristallnacht. They traveled via the Hook of Holland to Harwich, arriving at Liverpool Street Station on December the 2nd, 1938. The Kindertransport would eventually bring about 10,000 children and teenagers to Britain from Germany, Austria, and the Czech lands, but that is less than 1% of the 1.5 million children murdered during the Holocaust. Meanwhile, negotiations dragged on between the Polish and German governments about the Polish Jews, including my grandfather, stuck in Zbążin. And eventually, agreement was signed under which the deportees would return to Germany for a limited time to settle their affairs, liquidate their businesses, and move back to Poland. And my grandfather arrived back in Berlin in May 1939, shortly before his son, my father, left on the Kindertransport. My grandfather meticulously packed his son's suitcase, and the Nazis gave very strict instructions about what the children could take with them. And everyone knew that the luggage could be searched before they crossed the border into Holland. And despite the strict rules, my father took with him this silver goblet that he had received as a bar mitzvah present from his Bet Zion synagogue 2 years before Kristallnacht. Accompanied by a whole gang of friends from school and from his Zionist youth group, my father boarded the Kindertransport train in Berlin. Although the children knew that these were dangerous times in Germany and that they were being sent to Britain for their own good, none of them imagined, as they waved goodbye, that so few would ever see their parents alive again. And I've always suspected that my grandparents, standing on the platform, could have had few illusions. And as they held back their tears, they knew that this could be the final farewell from their son, which it proved to be. After my father's kinder transport arrived in London, he and his mates boarded the night train to Scotland to Whittingham Farm School on the grounds of Lord Balfour's estate. And my father, an ardent Zionist, was thrilled to be in the same building where Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour had penned the Balfour Declaration 21 years earlier. And the very day my father arrived in Scotland, on May the 23rd, 1939, the House of Commons voted to effectively cancel the Balfour Declaration by imposing draconian immigration quotas for Jews wanting to come to Palestine. And when Balfour's niece, Blanche Dugdale, heard about the vote, she exclaimed, "But what will become of the millions of Jews in Europe?" And today, we all know the answer to her question. My father was one of the lucky ones. The events of Kristallnacht that he witnessed led directly to the Kindertransport program that brought him to the safety of Britain. He completed his education on his Scottish farm boarding school. He became a British soldier. He married. And under his wedding canopy in December 1944, he and my mother, herself a refugee from Germany, made a vow. They vowed that they would rebuild the Fachler tribe that my father, by then, suspected had been swallowed up in the Nazi murder machine. My birth was the start of this rebuilt tribe. And to his dying day, my father never found out where, when, or how his parents and dozens of family members were murdered. It is not an exaggeration to say that my parents fulfilled their vow with a vengeance. They became patriarch and matriarch of a tribe that today includes 7 children, 1 foster child, 29 grandchildren, 115 great-grandchildren, and 15 great-great-grandchildren. And my mother lived to see her first great-great-grandchild. By the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht in 2013, exactly 10 years ago today, my then 90-year-old father was the last survivor of the original Bet Zion synagogue in Berlin. And it was natural that he was invited to be the keynote speaker at the rededication ceremony for the rebuilt synagogue. And together with over 20 family members, I accompanied my father from Jerusalem to Berlin to the same synagogue that he watched being smashed up 75 years earlier. In the 500-strong audience was Israel's chief rabbi, Moscow's chief rabbi, the German minister of the Interior, and the head of the World Jewish Congress, Ronald S. Lauder. My father gave a mesmerizing and evocative description of the events of Kristallnacht. Pointing to a window in the synagogue, he said, "I could almost touch that window from my bedroom window. That's how close I was to the destruction on Kristallnacht." He received a 10-minute standing ovation. 19 months after addressing the Berlin Kristallnacht Commemoration, my father passed away in his beloved Jerusalem. And at the end of the 30-day mourning period, my father's 29 grandchildren chose my son Amit to deliver the eulogy at a packed synagogue in Jerusalem. Describing his grandfather as a big man, Amit looked at the audience and asked, "Can anyone imagine Eli Fachler being scared? Being really terrified?" Well, on Kristallnacht, he was. And we know this, said Amit, from his own words at the 75th Kristallnacht Commemoration in Berlin. He told that Berlin audience that the only occasion in his life when he shook with fear was on Kristallnacht. Picture this, said Amit. 15-year-old Eli was standing with his mutti and sister Miriam behind the curtains. And Amit quoted from my father's words in Berlin 20 months earlier. After the synagogue was destroyed, a drunken Nazi officer came to our building and yelled up the stairs, "Are there any Jews alive up there?" Amit continued, "In his Kristallnacht speech in Berlin, my grandfather repeated this sentence again and again. Sind da oben noch Juden am Leben? Amit paused and looked out at the packed synagogue, and he concluded his eulogy by saying, "As my grandfather looks down on us from heaven, we can proudly answer, yes, there are Jews still alive up there."